Good evening, my brothers and sisters. I'm happy to talk to you tonight with a heavy heart. I'm constantly burdened by what is becoming of the church and who the church is, who and whose the church is. Because in life, what matters is not only who you are, but whose you are. When I look back over the arguments we've always had during the drive for the regulation of religion, when the anti-regulation of religion started raising objections, part of our argument was it cannot be an earthly government which defines what church is. We were saying the South African government, by virtue of being an earthly government, possesses no capacity or spiritual understanding to tell what church is and who church is. And that is why we got taken aback. We were quite shocked when supposedly men of God got into the same understanding within every government about the whole issue of true and false prophets. And what shocked us was, how did you come about involving government in a matter which can only be resolved by those who walk with God? Because the danger is an earthly government has no idea of who we are and whose we are. Because we were not formed by them. And the terms of reference for operations cannot be determined by them. Please follow me. And our concern was, we should not allow these men who exist by the will of man to interfere with a body set up by the will of God. We should not. And that's what was our argument, and that's still our argument today. Because basically, an earthly government possesses no capacity and no spiritual intelligence to even come as near as understanding who the church is, what the church is, whose the church is. And that's the problem I have right now with the line of reasoning we have taken, where we try to justify our return to public worship by showing how we shall be helping government in furthering its purpose. We don't want to go into public worship because we shall run feeding schemes. We want to go back to public worship because God said we should not neglect it. We should not neglect the coming together of saints. And it was reasonable that while the whole society was locked indoors, we did not insist on public worship. What's the use of a shepherd without a flock? We had been raised by the Lord to shepherd his flock. So while the flock was locked behind doors, it gave sense to us that there was no need to venture out. Because who would we be pastoring? But the church is out in public. The flock is out in public. Do we wait for an earthly government to tell us to continue doing what they did not commission in the first instance? Let me read a verse. I think I've given you enough context of our discussion today. I'm reading from Daniel 1. This is after Nebuchadnezzar had marched on Jerusalem and had destroyed the temple and carried the Jews into exile. Now, he sits there and he realized that we have destroyed their physical temple. We have displaced them from their city. They are our exiles. But unless we redefine and reinform their worldview, we don't have their submission. Then he says, they are temporary. As a matter of fact, Nebuchadnezzar never saw it as temporary. Their exile has disorientated them, but we have to take advantage of this disorientation by controlling their entire paradigm. We must be the informants of their paradigm. We have to determine what their world outlook is, what their state of mind is, even towards the ways of their God. And Nebuchadnezzar says, no, let's do this. Let's look among them for young men without spot, without wrinkle. A lot of us would not have made it. They must be flawless, but they must be of royal birth. Don't just take anyone. And let us teach them the ways of our God. Let us teach them our ways. Let's put them through our schools. Let's give them privileges the rest of their people don't have. And we shall be assured of the fact that we shall have their service forever. So they look among them, and among these they find 4 Jewish boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But listen to this. The first thing Nebuchadnezzar did when he saw the glory of God and the grace of God, the anointing of God and the presence of God upon Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the first thing he did was he gave them the names of his gods. That's the first thing he did. Because don't forget, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are Persian names. They are not Jewish names. He changed their titles. He messed up with their identity. I think the picture is beginning to form now. He looked among those who were of a real priesthood, a holy nation, God's own chosen people, who were set about to declare the praise of him who called them out of darkness into the wonderful light of his son. He chose among those. And the first thing he said is, let's change the identity and give them privileges the rest of their people don't have. Listen, the young man's name, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. God, my Father, oh Lord. I'm only smiling to keep from crying. I wish somebody understood what I'm trying to say. They were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the first thing he did was rename them. And they gave them Babylonian names. Now, Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach, and Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. Up to today, when you talk about these men, we don't talk Mishael, Azariah, and Hananiah. We talk Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's how strong that move was, that it completely eradicated their true identity. That is basically There came a time where if you send Daniel, Ananiah, Mishael, and Azariah back to their people, and somebody says, hey, Ananiah, they would never respond. They're waiting for, hey, Shadrach. They would never respond. Now, how is this significant? Follow me. So he changed identity. 2. Then he says, the other thing we have to do is, they need to get food from me. And one from my kitchens. They must sit around my table. Yeah. Now you should understand what is happening. Let them not eat with the rest of their people. Let them not sit with the rest of their people. Let's change not only their identity, let's change their location, and let's give them privilege. And you should understand that the king's food did not come directly from his kitchen. They went from his kitchen via the altars of his gods. And sitting there, enjoying privilege that the rest of God's people did not enjoy, losing identity, being detached from your people in identity and orientation, and be given privileges that did not necessarily come from God, was a process in redefining, reinforming, and redetermining their paradigm. Beyond that point, the identity, orientation, location, and privilege would be so altered that it will be Babylon which becomes their term and point of reference. And the Bible says, Daniel rises and he says he was determined not to defile himself by eating the food the king offered. And he asked for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Hey, now you ask yourself, what does this have to do with where we are? Let's come back to South Africa. I'm wondering from Reverend Dube, the founders of the ANC, throughout the ages, Chief Lutuli, you come through a lot of men of God rose there. Father Mkachwa, Reverend Chikani, Desmond Tutu. I wonder what would have happened if those men had taken their cue, their identity, their orientation from an earthly government. And the government of that day, from Verwoerd there, Swart, Malan, B.J. Foster, P.W. Botha. I wonder where we would be, especially with the struggle against the oppression of people. Because don't forget, as various men of God have said, I listened to Reverend Chikane some years back, and he says, no, it's not the political struggle that informed my disdain and my commitment to the liberation of my people, but the fact that I was a man of God and could not reconcile what was happening to the God I served. So by admission, Reverend Chikane says, I was not a servant of the armed struggle, I was a servant of God throughout. And if anything became clear to me was, I was fighting a battle assigned by God, because God hates injustice. And these men gave their lives, they were tortured, because they refused to eat around the table of an earthly government. They refused to have their identities changed. And they refused to be entertained by a kingdom that did not understand who they were and whose they were. And they suffered. Some died, others were imprisoned. Most were tortured. But let's freeze this moment and ask ourselves, who had called Reverend Chikane? Was it the ANC? Was it the SACP? Was it Kosatu? Who had called him? And if you're going to answer to me, if you're going to answer me about who called them, the question is, when did he stop calling them? Because if he called them, they're from 1912 and they came man after man after man of God, Beas Nodir, man after man after man of God, who were driven into this not by a political agenda, but by a prophetic motivation, a prophetic burden. Who retired them? Because if they were called by the ANC, we understand why they went into retirement. Some of them are still alive now. Who had called them? Was there any particular danger Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego saw in sitting around the king's table, in leaving their prophetic office to be entertained in the palace? Is it possible that where we are in South Africa, we've been betrayed by prophets, pre-1994 prophets, whose identity was redefined, whose ownership was redefined, whose privileges were refined, whose location was transformed by an earthly government? Because the truth is, if it's God who called them, did God retire them in 1994? Did they allow themselves to be swallowed into structures that would render their prophetic calling irrelevant and insignificant? You decide. Were they silenced? When they found themselves working with a people, listen to me, a people they have come into power but motivated by different, because a true man of God would not have been motivated by a need to run the country. The ANC, the PAC, and all other anti-apartheid movements would be motivated by that. The ANC would be motivated by a desire to run this country. The PAC the same, and a lot of other struggle movements do the same. But the men of God would not have been motivated by a desire to run the country. They would have been burdened by a prophetic calling. They would have been burdened by a sense of ownership by God. And they would be actively involved, because let me tell you, demons don't die. They just change homes. There is not a single earthly government right now that is not under the control of the devil. That's why the Bible calls him the God of this world. Why did they suffer? Were they motivated by a political agenda? If they were motivated by a political agenda, it explains why they retired. But here is the next point of my questioning. If the apartheid government then had given them instructions that were contrary to the Great Commission, would they have carried them? My other question is, for all they did, they fronted, they opened the churches to cadres, they helped channel youth out of the country to fight for a good cause. What motivated them? Was it a desire? Did they see that as an extension of the work of Christ, that God hates injustice? God cares for the poor, the disenfranchised? And right now, faced with the present day crisis, what would their decision be? We read day before yesterday, and I explained myself. I'm one of the people who got extremely angry with anyone insisting that there should be church, considering the common threat the country faced. And as a good citizen, as I said last night, I stayed indoors for 37 days because I'm called to people. And there were no people out in public. I'm called to people. When Christ declared the anointing upon his life, he said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to deliver those who are oppressed, and to declare a season of God's favor upon the damned. The anointing was for the people. So from 26 March to 1 May, there were no people in public except emergency workers and high-level essential services. And I thought it gives sense. And I looked at the Constitution, chapter 36, 37. He said religious rights. And don't forget, as I said to you, the right to preach is not a constitutional right. The right that the Constitution recognizes is purely coincidental. I would still preach if the Constitution did not declare preaching a right. I would still tell people that Jesus Christ is Lord, even if the Constitution did not give me that right. The Constitution reasonably endorsed that right, did not give me that right. Freedom of association. The Bible tells us in Psalm 133 and tells us in Hebrews 10, and the Bible tells me in 1 John chapter 1 from verse 3 that when the church gathers together, there is an anointing that flows. In Hebrews 10, there is an encouragement that flows there. 133 says there is a cleansing that flows there. So I meet because God said I should meet, and I did not meet because there was no one to meet with. And that's why for 37 days I was shut in with my wife and children. I did not even have access to my son in Bloemfontein. That's how much of a good citizen I was. But suddenly I began to see government open pockets of society faced with the same threat. I saw them open pockets of society, and all of a sudden a people I've been called to were walking the streets, queuing in malls, queuing in government feeding schemes, queuing for SASSA. And the next question that I ask myself is, why am I sitting indoors? Because a people have been called to minister to, have been let loose in society. And the last instruction he gave was, go out into the whole world. We tried social media. We sat there, we preached every Sunday, and we realized that even in 50-member churches, 100-member churches, we're not reaching everybody because not all is on social media. Even those on social media don't all have data, but the majority of the people don't have data at all. That means basically, the last, don't forget, the 26th was a Thursday. That means the last time people have been to church was 4 days earlier, which is about the 22nd. From the 22nd of March, some people who need the encouragement that not government, God said they need, had no encouragement. The people who benefit from the cleansing that the Bible tells in the book of 1 John 1 happens when the people are gathered, they don't have access to that cleansing. The anointing that the Bible says flows when we come together, according to Psalm 103, people had no access to. But understood, we gave them calls, those who had phones. And we understood, we were locked indoors. But then we began to see government arbitrarily prioritize issues and matters that were not given priority in the scriptures. And we began to realize that according to section 36 and 37, every limitation on my right, and don't forget, it's not a constitutional right. The right to preach is a divine right. That's why the United Nations declared religious right a fundamental human right. It's not a right that a constitution can give or take. It's a right, it's fundamental to human existence. But then section 36 says no right is absolute. So when it's reasonable, and I said to him, I said, it's reasonable. Yeah, there's a threat of a virus there, and the whole purpose, because also the section 36 and say it must be purposeful. The purpose was they wanted to flatten the curve. That means to create enough opportunity for the preparedness of the medical fraternity. Because they did not say, we are locking you down to eliminate the disease. I'm not a virologist, I'm not an immunologist, I'm not any of those fancy guys. But they've said that this disease must reset in infections. For that to do that, let's leave that to them. They never said we were locked down to eliminate the disease. They said to flatten the curve. Flattening the curve gave the medical science fraternity the opportunity to go into preparedness, the whole four-circle disaster management process. They were to go into preparedness. They were going to go into all the readiness and all those things. So they were to organize, and it gave sense that let's just be shut down. And for a while, let's sacrifice things that are very fundamental to human existence. But now we realize now that after 6 weeks, if the government is not prepared, it will never be prepared. And bury me from worship you will never make them any more prepared. But as I sat there, I saw members of our congregation who drive taxis go back to work. I saw members of our congregation who pack shelves. I saw members of our congregation who are on SASA queue for money. I saw members of the congregation who are poor queue for food parcels. I saw members of my congregation in the townships never going through any lockup at all. And the question that came to me was, are people only unsafe in churches? And I began to realize that this is beginning to tamper with my divine calling. And maybe the problem is I compromise. Because I could never imagine pre-1994 prophets bowing to an earthly government's arbitrary decisions that went out without any consultation. They never consulted us. They don't consult us. They're talking to a handful of guys from the SACC who they think represent the whole church, and the guys from the SACC have not been honest enough to say, no, we're just an interest group. We don't represent the church. We're just an interest group. The SACC boasts about 4 to 6 million members, and there are 48 million Christians in South Africa. So who represent the other 44 million? They never even consulted us. But we see them consulting liquor boards and consulting mining organizations and consulting that. But it would be stupid to think an earthly government would prioritize worship to God, discipling of nations. We would be stupid because a few months before we went into this lockdown, they were fighting religion. They wanted us regulated. And what I'll never submit to is a situation where they're saying to us, no, for us to open you up, you must show registration, because from the very beginning, from the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, from the birth of the church in Acts and throughout, we were not required to be the rulers. Otherwise, they would not have persecuted us. And part of the problem is we are a church, though raised by God. 1912 is the earliest recorded formation of a resisted movement by church on the African continent. 1912, when the ANC was born, that was the birth of the first liberation struggle movement on the entire African continent, and it was formed by the church. They were not driven by a political agenda. They were driven by a godly agenda. God hates injustice. And that's why throughout 1912, you know how many Christians went into exile, how many Christians died, you know how many preachers were imprisoned because they would not bow to an earthly government in favor of the Great Commission, in favor of the scriptures. They opened the scriptures. They were tortured. In 1994 came the people, they led into liberation. Because if my understanding is well, politicians did not lead the church into liberation. The church led the politicians into liberty. The church within the context of its political calling. We birthed the ANC. We birthed this movement. They're not only the ANC. We had believers throughout all these liberation movements. We were under the impression that we are playing the role of a prophet. A prophet they discarded when they came into power. They took few of us, like they did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They brought them to the palace. We saw them become premiers. We saw them become director generals. We saw them become mayors. So we saw them elevated, and they were sitting with Nebuchadnezzar. Their identities were changed. They were no longer reverend. They were director general, mayor, premier, the late Stoffel. They were all swallowed into this. And when they sat around the table with Nebuchadnezzar and they ate with him, they compromised their move. This is what Daniel saw thousands of years in advance, and then he said no to it. These men failed to say no, and in the process, they sold us out in favor of political acceptance. They were embraced, and that is why right now some of them are alive today, but they've been silenced by compromise. They've lost their prophetic calling, and in the process, they're about to sink a generation that takes its cue from an earthly government that is only concerned with money. The government says, no, it gives a lot of sense, you know. It gives a lot of sense that, no, we must open up the economy. Christ says you can't serve God and money. And I'm not an irresponsible idiot. I did economics. I did financial management, financial accounting. I'm not an idiot. I understand the implications of getting the economy going. As a matter of fact, we are commanded in Jeremiah 29 that pray for the prosperity of the city, because when the city prospers, so shall you. So I'm not ignorant of those factors, but I'm saying we can never sacrifice the Great Commission over arbitrary, erroneous, glaringly conflicting instructions. Because anybody who has gone beyond grade 5 knows that there is deep conflict within cabinet itself. So many conflicting messages that no smoking, smoking is all right, no hairdressing saloons. And these men have not, in all their writings, they have not even mentioned where church is supposed to go back into community life. Maybe they're not supposed to, because maybe it's not in their place to start with to do so. And I'm saying, church, where we are, we have to come to a point where we ask ourselves, society is alive. Which apostle, since Christ left this earth, was given permission by an earthly government to preach Christ? Isn't that why they killed them? Isn't that why they imprisoned them? Isn't that why they scared them and hid them? Isn't that why they say to Peter and John, don't preach in this name anymore? Our people need us out there. And the need for us cannot be subject to government's authority. Am I preaching rebellion? When injustice is law, rebellion is the godless response. And if you don't believe me, go and ask Dr. Dube why he founded the ANC. If you don't believe me, go and ask Chief Lituli there why he committed himself to this cause. Go and ask Pastor Mkacha, he's still alive. Go and ask Reverend Chigan Desmond Tutu, he's still alive. Go and ask all these men of God, why did you risk your lives? And right now, I'm not an idiot. If a taxi driver, which I don't despise, if an informal vendor, and I don't despise them, if a cashier, and I don't despise them, if a pharmacist assistant, and I don't despise them, if an ESCOM electrician, and I don't despise them, but if these ordinary members of the community like me have enough sense to don a mask, sanitize, keep a distance, am I not so idiotic that I can't go back to doing my work on the same basis? It's an insult to the body of Christ. It's an insult to every preacher of the gospel. It's an insult to the body of Christ that society is safe anywhere else except the church. It's an insult. And somebody says, no, but people died at church. People died in hospital. Doctors die in hospital. Nurses die in hospital. Have you closed all hospitals? This is time for the church to rise. And let's stop looking at those whose identities were changed and redefined by an earthly government. Let's not look at those who compromise themselves over the satisfaction of their appetites. They took great salaries, are on great pensions, they did all benefits, and they've forgotten the people of God right now because they went into bed with an earthly government. For some reason, they retired because they thought they'd been called by the anti-apartheid movement. They did not realize that they were called by God to fight injustice despite who brings it. They fell in love with political faces. They didn't realize that the spirit behind human politics is the spirit of the evil one. We've petitioned a government that thinks we are complete idiots. They think we are such idiots that they're about to send teenagers back to public life. They're about to send grade 7s. This government says, no, grade 7s can be trusted with public life. And among those grade 7s are Christian children who've had to leave their Christian parents at home. This government says they're fine, as long as there's no preacher there. And among the teachers, one of the principals of high schools in Bloemfontein is a partner and a member in our congregation. They say, no, Mos, you are safe. As long as Shim is not around, you are safe to take the grade 7s and the grade 12s. As long as Mos, you are meeting in a school, and as long as there is no chorus there, you are safe, Mos. So Moses Malawani, a member in our congregation, is back on duty preparing for the students to return. He's not even tested if he's positive or not. They don't even know if he has any underlying conditions. They say, no, it's fine. There are teachers with diabetes. There are old teachers. There are teachers with underlying diseases. The government says, no, that's fine. You are safe, Moses. And the grade 7s and the grade 12s, you are safe. We know that you shall be responsible enough to fumigate the classes, Moses. And we know that the grade 7s will be sensible enough to wash their hands, to keep a safe distance, to wear their masks. And you know that your Christian staff members will be sensible enough, Moses, to teach these kids, and as long as there's no preacher there and there's no Jesus there. I say tonight, to hell with that. I say tonight, if government is not going to listen to what you say, we're going to have to rise like John and Peter and say, look, we'd rather obey God, not you. You're going to have to rise like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that day. Nebuchadnezzar said, no, you shall pray only to me. And they said, King, we're not going to bow to you because our God will rescue us. But even if our God did not rescue us, we'll still not bow to you. We're going to do that. We're going to forget about the traitors, the old prophets, the pre-1994 prophets, some of whom are walking the streets now. They were not afraid of a government which had the strongest military on the African continent. The apartheid government had the strongest military on the African continent. And they beat them up, but they could not silence them. They ostracized them. They put them in solitary confinement. But they soon forgot who they were and whose they were. They thought they were servants of the struggle. And they're sitting around the king's table. They've compromised themselves so much right now that they may not be seen to be at loggerheads with an earthly government. So we are not afraid. If we must die, we shall die. We will not be the first generation of believers. I'm saying to you, I sat in with 30 other leaders, a Zoom meeting, a lot of people. And we wrote a petition to COGDA. I see a lot of groups have petitioned government. We shall try the courts. If all else fails, we are going back to public worship and let government arrest us. We will not be the first generation of believers to suffer for their faith. As a matter of fact, there will be something wrong with us if we never suffered. But we'd rather obey God, not man. And this is where that has gone way beyond even the constitutional provisions and constraints. Because this is no longer reasonable. It's no longer reasonable to prevent churches from meeting. It's no longer justifiable. It's no longer saving the purpose. In the course of locking us down, they looked at what's happening around the world and what saved everybody else. They came with masks. Can you support that? Even though a group of dissident scientists are saying these masks are destroying the people, said fine. Government says you should wear them. A group of scientists said this over-sanitized environment is detrimental to us. We say, but we'll sanitize. Today I went out to the shop and I bought more sanitizers. And we have enough sense to know that we don't need government to take care of ourselves. They're treating us like idiots. I don't need government to take care of myself. I don't need government to regard the safety of the congregation. I don't need them. The government cannot teach me to love the congregation God called me to disciple. Government cannot teach me to love children God used me to birth. So they can't treat us like idiots. But some of the people back at the bank, somebody just wrote here, we're back at SARS. Some of the people back at SARS are preachers of the gospel. Because not all of us are into full-time ministry. I visited with my friend yesterday. He has a contract with Transnet. He's back working there. So even preachers are out there. Preachers, for economic purposes, are trusted with masks. They're trusted with washing their hands. They're trusted with 6 feet. Hey, what about Reverend Prince Koti in Klerksdorp? He's a minor. He's a preacher of the gospel with the AFM. They're trusting him. Koti, whatever your job is underground, go back there. We trust you with your mind. But no, not for church. This is rubbish. This is an abomination. And this is a privilege God gave us. It was not a government-given privilege. And we'll never let government take it from us. I pray that God destroys your fear, your compromise, and the love for your life. I pray that God grants you spiritual sight to see this. Because not only are we under obligation to follow God, we're also under obligation not to be ignorant of the devil's devices. Let me close this transmission by reading from Matthew 16 what Jesus told you. And I want you to think about this. And I am saying, after we have tried everything and they still won't let us worship, we're going to have to worship without their permission. They can come and arrest me. My whereabouts are known. I died the day Jesus came into my life. I don't care for my, but I'm not different from any man. What about your children? What about the children of all those people who have been killed by Muslims in the Middle East? What about the children of those who have been killed by Islamic radicals in Nigeria? What about the children of those who have been killed by Xi Jinping? What about, I would not be the first man to die and leave a widow and orphans behind. I won't be, and I won't be the last. But Jesus told us, as I close, in the book of Matthew 16, he says here, then Jesus said to his disciples in verse 24, if any of you, I'm reading in the New Life Translation, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. You must deny yourself. You must take up your cross, a symbol of death, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you'll save it. And what will it profit you if you gain the whole world, but if you lost your soul? May the Lord greatly bless you. This is Brother Shimichi Obakwekodu. We shall talk tomorrow at 10.